welcome to TENGRIDOME. I'm your host, Iggy. Well, that card was pretty good, wasn't it? Speaking, of course, about UFC 267, and I think we would all agree that this card was pretty damn good. And the main event of that card certainly warrants some in-depth discussion. Speaking, of course, about the headliner for this card. Petr Yan versus Cory Sandhagen. And while in the process of recording the recap, my first attempt to record the recap for that event, I've realized that personally I think Cory Sandhagen versus Petr Yan warrants its own in-depth look, and so I'm going to break this discussion in two parts. We're going to discuss all the things that Petr Yan has done to navigate all the things, all the looks, all the different cool stylistic quirks that Cory Sandhagen presented to Yan. And then I'm going to talk about everything else, depending on how much time the discussion of Yan versus Sandhagen would take. Also, you're going to hear me trying to settle on multiple different pronunciations of Cory Sandhagen's name, because everyone seems to pronounce it differently. I think the UFC announcers pronounce it as Sandhagen, others pronounce it as Sandhagen, and I'm not sure which one is more correct. And also, I have a tendency to anglicize Slavic names because it makes the flow of my speech in spoken English much easier. But obviously the correct pronunciation is Petr Yan, and you're gonna hear it a bunch as well, so bear with me. But regardless, the UFC is, as always, seems very reluctant to put on the lower weight class fighters on the main event spot. There were a couple times when they put. I think they made Davis and Figueiredo headline his cards, but overall, it's not a common occurrence, and it wasn't the case here. The actual main event of the card was Glover Teixeira versus Jan Blachowicz. I honestly don't know why they did that, because obviously anyone with an eye for the sport would have realized that what the actual main event of the card really is. But regardless, I'm only mentioning this because when I was watching the card live, going from Yan versus Sandhagen to Glover Teixeira to Jan Blachowicz versus Glover Teixeira felt like celebrating the birth of your firstborn son, returning from the hospital, and then immediately getting T-boned by a dump truck. That's how it felt. And this aside, it's kind of the story of the card as well, and kind of the story of most cards where the momentum is excellent, the pacing is excellent, the one fight after another, banger after banger after banger, and then suddenly the big men appear. But we're used to this. It's not a new thing. It's not a new trend that threatens to ruin MMA. It was this way for the entirety of the sport's history, essentially. So I'm not gonna prattle on about it much longer, and I'm just gonna let's just dive in, shall we? Let's just discuss what we set out to discuss. Petr Yan versus Cory Sandhagen. One of the most... I would straight away, I would admit that it was kind of one-way traffic, particularly after the second half of the second round, but it was interesting enough to kind of hold my attention and still feel I still felt very tense watching it because there was so much stuff going on. Both fighters were presenting each other so many different looks at once. You would still have to watch it very closely to realize just how much information they're both processing to try and mount their own offense. Naturally, Petr Yan still proved to be way too good for Cory's direction changes and feints and all the volume to dupe him into passivity. But one thing has to be pointed out, that Cory Sandhagen that showed up against Petr Yan on that night would have pretty much whooped the rest of the division without much issue. Aside from some certain caveats, of course. One thing has to be mentioned. I think it's very important. It's more of a description for the philosophical approaches to fighting. The contrasting philosophical approaches to fighting showcased by Petr Yan and Cory Sandhagen. Cory Sandhagen, to me, in my eyes, he sort of represents this already existing MMA meta, the volume-based meta, and the meta based around ceaseless movement and constant volume, and his footwork. It's very good, but it's very good in that same MMA mold, the Dominic Cruz style of movement and the TJ Dillashaw style of movement, what everyone thought good footwork looks like. And his entire style in general is kind of like, it's more in your face, it's more directly visible, it's more, it kind of catches your eye much faster. It catches your eye up front purely because of how many things he does at the same time at any given moment. And Petr Yan is decidedly not that. He's very much a minimalist, but he's not a minimalist in terms of only using a couple tools or only preferring a couple different looks. He still does as much, if not more, things as Cory Sandhagen does, but it's decidedly more subdued. It's more subtle. And I think if you were to watch other more well-established sports such as boxing or kickboxing or Muay Thai, you would find many different parallels between Petr Yan and how Petr Yan does things with some of the best fighters in those sports. Particularly his approach to people tend to call it snowballing, but it's not snowballing as much as it is corralling his opponents into situations where they would be outmatched after gathering enough information about their preferences and about their habits to sort of punish them. Now, what do I mean by that? It's all very vague. It kind of sounds strange. To some, it may sound like I'm veering towards that mind smash territory of kind of like analyzing their body language. No, I'm not doing that. I'm actually talking about very tangible things. All right, so the philosophical approaches to fighting. Let's take someone like Cory Sandhagen, for example, or like someone like Max Holloway. What do these fighters do to win their fights? They kind of, I presume they still study their opponents because they come in with certain very specific adaptations meant to help them navigate the matchups in question. But what Cory Sandhagen and Max Holloway or other fighters in that similar mold do, they look at a fighter and then see what the fighter does, learn it, and then ask themselves, what should I need to do to be the best me against that guy on that night? What does Cory Sandhagen needs to do to be the best Cory Sandhagen he could possibly be on that night? Meanwhile, someone like Volkanovski or, for example, prime Fedor Emelianenko and other similar fighters, what do? They look at a fighter, they study the fighter, they study the matchup that they're gonna meet, and they ask themselves, what is the first level, top priority adaptations I need to do to be able to navigate this guy? What do I need to do to sort of kind of adjust my whole style to navigate the questions presented by my opponent of me. So it's kind of more strategic. It's kind of like more about doing high level, first level adaptations from which they make the specific adjustments, the specific technical adjustments that they bring into the fight later on the day of the fight. So their entire camp is predicated upon answering the broader questions presented to them by their opponent, kind of like, in which direction should I take the fight? Should I pressure? Should I go back? Should I go on the back foot? Should I wrestle? That kind of stuff. Meanwhile, with Cory Sandhagen, it's more like in the moment, more like this guy does such and such things in the fight. I'm gonna I'm gonna do the same thing I do, but adjust it in a very specific way to kind of brute force my way through. I'm not saying it's a bad approach, and with most matchups it works splendidly. It's completely fine to use that. However, when met with someone like Petr Yan, and I'm gonna point out in which way Petr Yan is different now. Petr Yan kind of looks at his opponent, he studies them, and then he goes, "Oh, I'm gonna take a round, maybe 2 rounds off even. I'm gonna take some time and see what this guy does. I've already studied the tape." And Paul Felder, I think, pointed this out on commentary. Paul Felder was actually very good that night. He said, meeting your opponent in the cage is very different from studying his footage. And so what Petr Yan does, he kind of tries to get a feel for his opponent's game. He kind of tries to figure out what he's going to do, figure out the precise timings of his opponent's offense, what it feels like to defend against this guy. And then, once his opponent shows him all his best looks, shows him all his best tools, Petr Yan goes, "Now I'm gonna make this guy pay for trying to do that against me." And I'm not speaking about very specific counters that he uses, and I'm gonna talk about how I'm not talking about the specific tools that he uses. They're different every time. What's important here is the concept of punishing your opponent for attempting to fight their own game. So it kind of serves as a direct counter to that type of. I don't like calling it a brute force approach, but it's kind of like I guess it works in this context. Cory Sandhagen tried to simply be Cory Sandhagen against Petr Yan, and Petr Yan let Cory Sandhagen do his own thing for however many minutes that he let him. And then he was like, "Oh, now I know what you're trying to do, and now I'm gonna punish you for trying to be yourself." Essentially, it's incredibly mentally draining to fight an opponent like that. It kind of ties really well into the overall game of Petr Yan, which is pressure, which is and it's not pressure in the in-your-face type of pressure that we've seen already in MMA. It's not the Tony Ferguson style of pressure. It's not Max Holloway swarming his opponents. And this is another thing. People often confuse pressure with swarming in MMA. And what Petr Yan does, that's how nuanced, patient, methodical pressure actually looks like. It's using. Jack Slack talks about it all the time. Talks about this concept of using your presence to wear down your opponent, to psych him out into making mistakes, and that's what Petr Yan excels at. And I cannot stress this enough. It's amazing to watch when he's able to do his own thing. But now we're gonna have to actually discuss the fight that took place. Kind of round by round, what was happening in the fight. Cory Sandhagen started very fast, and I saw Sean Madden on Twitter talk about how he felt like it was a bit too fast of a start from Cory, and I guess I think I know where he's coming from. I suppose they believed that it's better for Cory to kind of let Petr Yan also have his slow first round and not show him all the cards that they have. But on the other hand, one of the more effective ways of winning rounds against Petr Yan is not. I guess in, now that I mention it, I don't think sparking Petr Yan out early is the way to go. I don't think it's gonna happen. Petr Yan is too fucking good for that to allow that to happen. I mean, of course, if he meets some kind of massive puncher, some kind of pound-for-pound threat with regards to punching power, he may get caught and he may get hurt. It's kind of inevitable. It's fighting, but his skill set would allow him to survive that pretty easily, I think. So, but I believe the thinking was that Cory felt like he should try and come out like a house on fire to kind of take that first round, like kind of like in that same style of thinking where people believe that Petr Yan is a slow starter and he's not, just likes to take the round off to kind of figure out what the opponent is gonna do. I don't think he's the type of guy who needs to kind of warm up. I think if he needs to start fast, he's gonna start fast. But I'm just kind of trying to explain what I believe the rationale was for that decision. But either way, Cory Sandhagen started very fast, started pouring on volume, using many different nifty looks, kind of like going front foot heavy to throw right hand leads, kind of going backwards to kind of like throw volume jabs to kind of make Petr Yan cover up, fill his vision with static, throwing many feints, going to the body very early, very hard, which is a good decision all the time. Like always a good decision. You should always go to the body early and hard in title fights. It's kind of like it's kind of a given, you know. I kind of expect elite fighters to know how to do that. And it would have worked against most opponents. It's a good approach against most any opponent in MMA, but with Petr Yan comes the danger of, well, first of all, you can beat the dog piss out of Yan's body with a baseball bat, and he's not gonna give a single flying fuck. The man has a supremely conditioned core. And I think he talked about it on the presser, in that he pays specific attention to conditioning his body against body shots, and that he has been hit with many body shots during the course of his training back when he competed in amateur boxing. And I presume when he started learning Muay Thai in Thailand, he got kicked to the body a whole bunch. It's kind of like, it's one of those examples of sport-specific athleticism that many people kind of forget about when talking about athleticism in MMA. People frequently take athleticism to mean scary, like frightening, explosive power, and it's not only that. Athleticism takes many forms. For example, Max Holloway is supremely athletic, but if you were operating by that NFL type metric, I guess, he wouldn't seem athletic, but he is. He has an iron chin. He has an iron chin. He has an endless gas tank. Those are very important for a fighter to have. Very important athletic, sport-specific athletic attributes to have. Both Cory and Yan have those in spades, actually. But I digress. The approach was fine. Conceptually, it's fine, but it's all wrong for Yan, you know? It's not the type of approach you should take against Yan. First of all, one of the things that, if you go back and watch that first round, one of the things that should be made evident to you, it may look like Yan is getting boxed up in that first round, and Danny Martin pointed this out immediately after the fight, and I think it's very important to put emphasis on that observation. Cory wasn't landing clean much of the time. He landed a couple good shots, but it wasn't like he wasn't boxing Petr Yan up. People may criticize Petr Yan for utilizing a high guard. That is, it's kind of basic, but it's a very surface level analysis, because the way Petr Yan utilizes his high guard is way more nuanced than someone like, for example, Iggy uses the high guard. His chin is always buried within his chest, essentially. He constantly folds on both hips, constantly rolls with punches. All all the punches that land on, if they land, they usually land on the top of his head. It's kind of the bull guard type thing. Jack Slag talks about in some of his articles, but it's not just that. He uses it situationally. He doesn't take all his punches on top of his head, because it's kind of, you're gonna hurt doing that all the time. And so he combines that with slips, with hand fighting, with constantly adjusting the elbows, the position of the elbows on the guard, in the guard. And so it kind of looks like he's getting boxed up, but he's not. He's constantly defending all the shots that are coming towards his head. And the punches that he also makes makes the effort of defending to the body, but it's kind of like due to how conditioned his core is. It seems like it's more of a secondary priority to him. It's not the typical thing of MMA fighters not knowing how to defend body shots. And Yan is kind of like, I can take this one. I can take that punch. I can take that punch. And then I'm going to counter that punch. Kind of tries to see by feel whether or not the shot is worth defending. It sounds wanky, but it's actually what elite fighters do. When you listen to them, when you listen to the interviews, and when you read some of the memoirs of certain fighters, where they would point out how they pay attention to things like his opponent's breathing, the power that comes with each shot. And it's very important, because if you go back and watch Yan's performance against Jose Aldo, you can see Petr Yan start realizing that the most power, Aldo always throws the first shot with as much power as he can, and then the power kind of wanes. And so he pays specific attention to tanking, blocking the first shot, and maybe tanking the couple follow-up shots to set up his counter. And it all happens in the moment. It all happens within seconds of the exchange happening. And that just kind of shows the depth and breadth of Petr Yan's potency in the pocket. But regardless, first round breezes through. Petr Yan kind of navigates all the looks that Cory Sandhagen was showing him, and instantly, kind of like within moments, he already has a picture in his head of what Cory Sandhagen is going to do. Cory Sandhagen has done a good job of kind of like using misdirection steps, showing that he's gonna exit one way and going the other, but Petr Yan was able to see through that. There wasn't, I don't think there were any moments where Petr Yan was like, where the fuck are you going? Like, being confused. He was constantly staying on top of Cory Sandhagen, and Cory Sandhagen was forced to use way more movement to get to where he wants, and contrast that to Petr Yan making maybe 3 small steps to get to where he wants, which is in front of Cory Sandhagen at all times, not letting Cory Sandhagen gain advantageous angles on him. And Cory Sandhagen looked to kind of push Petr Yan backwards in the first round, which is a good idea, I suppose, but in the process, it kind of revealed the extent of his toolkit within that first round by trying to do that, by trying to start fast. I think that's why Sean Madden was feeling so much trepidation about Cory Sandhagen starting fast. But Yan was essentially forced to start countering right off the gate, and he kind of connected with. Cory Sandhagen had a couple close calls with Yan's hooks in that first round, because Yan started countering the hooks to the body that Cory was landing with, and looping those kind of like casting hooks over Cory Sandhagen's shoulders, and Cory Sandhagen had the instincts to kind of cover up. And he kind of was... he defended the hooks well up until the point where Yan made a specific adjustment. And I'm going to get into that. So anyway, the first round ends. And that's where the contrast in corner work starts to shine. It starts to make itself evident after the first round already. It's a very specific criticism I have towards corner work in that I find this happening very often with American corners in particular, in that American corners kind of preoccupy themselves with giving pep talks more than they try to actually give tactical advice, tactical information, data, actionable data. It's all like, you've got this, champ. Come on, bro. Let's get this bread. That type of stuff. And contrast that to Yan's corner. Here is the translation that I've written down. It's a translation of the advice that Yan received in his corner. It's not full advice because the camera switched back and forth, but the gist of it, I think I managed to get the gist of it. After the first round, what did the corner say to Petr Yan? I quote, "Great job so far. Keep pressing. Look for kicks on stance switches." This is significant because both fighters were switching stances all over the place. And switching stances presents different openings for different strikes. And so, right out of the gate, the corner told him to look for kicks on stance switches. And Petr Yan pulled in one of the best striking performances, one of the best kicking performances in MMA, body kicking performances in MMA that I've ever seen. So they told him to look for kicks on stance switches, and they told him to not retreat for free. They told him to look for back foot counters. That's a direct quote. Do not retreat for free, look for back foot counters. It's an important, obviously very important advice, but you notice that Petr Yan never took a backward step, essentially, for the duration of the rest of the fight. And the most important advice they've given him after this one was, do not concede the hand fight. Cory Sandhagen was doing a very good job of tying up Petr Yan's hands. He's done an excellent job of doing that. He constantly kept fighting with Yan's hands. It's just that Petr Yan adjusted to it. And then in the first round, why Cory Sandhagen had so much success landing with so much volume? It wasn't clear volume, but he was landing a lot on the guard nonetheless. And the reason for that was that he kept checking Yan's hands. He kept trying to pin his hands to his head and trying to kind of loop his punches around that and work around the guard. Kind of tried to manipulate Yan's guard. And it's a very good idea. It's just that Yan kind of caught up on that. Didn't let him do that for much of the fight from that point onwards. And so the full advice was that don't concede the hand fight. Either pull your hand back and counter, or engage in the hand fight and look for kicks. And Yan did both. And from the second round onwards, you could see Yan starting to more actively engage in the hand fight. And whenever he engaged in the hand fight, he looked for kicks. And whenever from the hand fight, Cory Sandhagen tried to pull away and to switch stances, he usually pulled away by switching the stance. And then the kick came blasting in. Immediately. Like right on cue. Petr Yan used the distance trigger of Cory Sandhagen pulling away from him. He felt him pulling away from him. And immediately the kick came in. Clean, sharp, right to the gut. With amazing technique to boot. Cory Sandhagen was still trying to pour on volume, but the volume became more sporadic and it became less clear. There were less clear connection. There were less even glancing connection. A lot of them landed on the shoulders, on the elbows, and a lot of them missed. Petr Yan started making Cory miss, and it's very important because that's when Petr Yan started doing what I was talking about, what he does. He started punishing Cory Sandhagen for trying to pour on volume. Still with me, right? So Cory Sandhagen finds that his offense is being stymied. He finds that his shots are landing less and less, and that Petr Yan is finding his chin and his body way more often than he does Petr Yan's. So what does he do? He tries to mix it up. He shoots kind of a desperation high crotch shot. Kind of like, he doesn't go to the knees. He kind of like bends over and tries to grab a hold of the high crotch, which I guess he can do sometimes. It's fine. But Yan's defense is too on point. Yan's takedown defense is too sharp. Yan immediately grabs a hold of the belly whizzer, where you kind of wrap your hand around your opponent's like midsection underneath the armpit, and then you pivot your hips backwards. Yan I think Yan didn't have the time to go full on knee sprawl, but he was able to kind of pivot and sprawl nonetheless. Kind of dragged Cory down to the ground with him, and Cory was left completely bent over with his head touching the canvas. And from there, Yan transitioned to a front headlock and kept holding Cory Sandhagen, kept pulling on him. From there, he wasn't in the position to snap him down, but it was still a very uncomfortable position for Cory, from which Yan was able to transition to the clinch. So he transitioned to the clinch. He let Cory stand up immediately. He kept holding the overhook from the front headlock, where he transitioned to the clinch from the front headlock. His arm was still wrapped up around Cory's left arm, and Yan's left arm was free, and so from there he landed an excellent elbow right off the break, and kind of, I guess, not on the break, but kind of still in the clinch. He landed the clinch elbow, and then he let Cory loose, I guess. So this sort of thing, we saw Yan work in transition like that before, more impressively, I'd say, in transition, but it still kind of showcases what Yan tends to look for. And we saw that play out multiple times during the fight, where they would kind of engage in the clinch situation, kind of engage in the grappling. Yan would defend the grappling situation, and then immediately blast Cory with a hard shot to the head or to the body, right as Cory looked to exit. And all these triggers that Yan has, they're very hard to kind of defend against. They're very hard to counter because they come so quickly, and they come on transition. They come in that gray area between grappling and striking. And this is what MMA is all about. This is about transitional attacks. It's kind of exploiting the rule set. The rule set allows you to work in transition like no other rule set on earth allows you to do that. And Yan mastered that. It's amazing to watch. Anyway, the rest of the second round plays out. Again, the corner advice. The corner advice after the second round, and they didn't show us corner advice. Didn't show us Yan's corner afterwards. I think it was round 1 and round 2, and I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter if whether they show this or not, because the groundwork for Yan's dominance was kind of like already established. But either way, corner advice. He's attempted the takedown mid-round to give you something to think about and attack in transition. Watch out for that. Take him down yourself at the end of the round if you feel like messing with him, but you're eating him alive with that double attack. Keep at it, the double attack. What are they talking about? We've established early that switching stances all over the place constantly opens up new avenues for attack, new openings. And when you're standing open stance, we talk about this a lot. Repeat listeners will understand what I'm talking about, but just for the sake of those who kind of may be a little confused. There's close stance matchups and there's open stance matchups. Close stance means both fighters are standing with their, well, kind of mirror images of each other, right? Both fighters are southpaw. Both fighters are orthodox. It opens up different angles from the open stance. From open stance, the lead hands are touching. You're able to hand fight from there. And what's open? What's there? The belly for the body kick. And the double attack means kind of mixing up, kind of turning the rear side of your body into a platform for launching similar looking attacks. Because the movement where you throw your rear hand looks very much like the movement you need to throw a rear kick. So it's kind of very hard to see. Even elite fighters kind of struggle with that sometimes, because if you conceal it well, even at the elite level, you're likely to connect. It's very hard to react to it. Especially if both fighters are constantly switching stances. It's kind of like, it's very hard to keep track of which stance is which, what openings are present, and it kind of creates more confusion. That's why fights between fighters who are switch hitters usually turn into such chaos. And I think once again, I think Jack Slack talked about this on some of his striking articles. But either way, more of the same. I think the third round was when Yan started really letting loose, started letting his hands fly, and that's where the knockdown came. Petr Yan kind of got the bead on Cory's direction changes. He already was able to follow him, and he was already throwing intercepting strikes. He was throwing hooks. He was throwing kicks. The kicks connected much more cleanly, of course, but what this tells us is that Yan already knew in which direction Cory is going to move, even though Cory was constantly feinting direction changes. But Cory was able to defend the intercepting strikes, the hooks at least, and so what does Yan do? Well, he goes one step further and adds a spinning attack instead of the hook. He kind of like tornado punches Cory Sandhagen and drops him like a bag of rocks. It's like many people have talked about this before, but it looked like it looked like a combo for a combination attack from a video game, except for real. And Yan kind of almost nailed Cory with that combination before, but the second connection was much more clean. He kind of caught Cory mid-step, circling off, and which created this collision where the back fist was able to connect right on the chin, kind of spun Cory's jaw around, and then immediately followed with a kind of arcing hook to the temple, and Cory just went down. And what's interesting to me, what's kind of like, it's a nifty little detail. Many people throw back fists kind of like with the knuckles pointed outward, while Yan was throwing it like a hammer fist. He was throwing not a back fist, but a spinning hammer fist. And this allows for a much harder connection with the harder part of your fist. Because the reason why you throw your fist during a normal punch with your knuckles pointed forward, it's because it creates a power line from your shoulder, from your hip, to your shoulder to your knuckles. Kind of like an unbroken line through which kinetic energy can be transferred. It creates for a smaller, for a smaller point of concentration for that force. And when you throw a back fist, like a normal back fist with your fist pointed upwards, with the thumb pointed upwards, like you're holding a mug, that disperses all that force. Also, you can injure your hand throwing a back fist like that. But when you turn your fist, kind of like with the thumb parallel to the ground, then the surface through which the energy is dispersed becomes smaller, and it also kind of makes for a harder. It basically makes for a harder connection. Not gonna go into too much detail with that one. Anyway, connecting, but then from the knockdown, Yan followed up on the knockdown with hellacious ground and pound, and there you could see the positional superiority in grappling. Granted, Cory was kind of buzzed, and so it's kind of like the old saying where each punch on the ground kind of like knocks belts, knocks off the colors of your belts if you have some kind of belt in jiu-jitsu. Either way, dangerous ground and pound. Cory nonetheless is able to get up. A scramble ensues, during which both fighters kind of use the threat of the heel hook to assume better, more advantageous positions. Then they get up, and then kind of like basically Cory weathers the storm to enter round 3. And they didn't show us Yan's corner that time. They showed us Sandhagen's corner. And that's where my criticism starts to ring more true with each passing second, because they didn't offer much in the way of tactical advice, like at all. It was, the whole minute was essentially them going, "You got this, champ, you got this, bro, let's bang this motherfucker out." That kind of stuff. And I guess there is concern, and there is genuine concern that you may overload your fighter, especially after a knockdown like that. But nonetheless, at least some tactical advice would be warranted here. And I'm not sure if it's them focusing on bringing their fighter back into it, being preoccupied with trying to raise the morale of their fighter, or them not understanding what Yan was really doing. But saying something like, look out for kicks, watch out for kicks, check the kicks, cross-check the kicks, look for counter kicks, look for uppercuts whenever Yan kind of like takes the punches on the top of his head and then ducks down, that kind of stuff. That would be better than nothing. I'm not sure if it would have worked, but it's better than nothing. Oh, one other thing I have to point out is that Yan fought much more upright than he usually does. Against most of his opponents, he kind of assumes this boxing crouch, where his back is kind of rounded, and he hides his chin behind his lead shoulder. It's kind of like a very traditional Soviet boxing type stance. And this one he fought much more upright. And obviously, well, one of the obvious reasons for that is that he was looking to kick a lot. But what's interesting is that conventional wisdom says that against a taller opponent, that's true in boxing at the very least. Against a taller opponent, you have to make yourself a smaller target. But since this is MMA and kicks are allowed, Petr Yan just decided to stand more upright. And normally that would lead to Cory landing. You would think that would normally lead to Cory landing much more with his punches, but that wasn't the case. So what this tells us, well, basically that Yan was preparing precisely for that scenario. Kind of assumed a more upright stance, and he immediately clicked in his head that, more punches are going to come, and so I'm going to have to be ready for that. And it became more evident with each passing exchange because, before the knockdown, that's when Yan connected with multiple hard body shots, and then immediately evaded all of Cory's counter offense. None of it landed. and then Yan immediately spun for the knockdown. It was a crazy exchange. You should basically just everyone go back and watch the fight in its entirety. It's amazing. Every exchange is kind of nuts. I'm wondering if I should have made this podcast. Wondering if I should have turned this podcast into a watch-along episode, kind of like the Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar episode, where I kind of broke down each exchange punch by punch. Maybe later. Anyway, round 3 starts. More and more exchanges. Yan is winning more and more exchanges, and then another highlight from the corner. It's the middle of round 3. The corner sees Cory starting to circle off past Yan's lead shoulder. They were standing open stance. Yan was southpaw, Cory was orthodox. He was circling off behind Yan's lead shoulder because, well, he was standing southpaw. And the corner yells, "The uppercut will get through." Yan pivots on his back foot. On his back foot. Normally, you usually only see that in striking sports. Uppercuts Cory with his rear hand off the pivot, switches orthodox, cuts off Cory's escape route, and traps him along the fence. Sounds simple, right? Just an insane sequence. Like, where do you see MMA fighters doing that? Just amazing. Yeah, and basically the fourth round is... well, I'm sorry, that was the middle of the... Was that the middle of the third round or the fourth round? If it was the middle of the third round, then the third round was when Yan hurt Cory the most, I guess. Anyway, kind of get him... It doesn't matter, really. I guess it matters because Yan works, kind of amps the ante round by round, but the fourth round was when Yan really opened up and started dominating, like really dominated the exchanges. He started dominating the exchanges way earlier than that, but kind of the fourth round is kind of punctuated. It was kind of a beatdown, really. And this is what forced Cory to kind of sit on his bicycle for the rest of the fifth. Cory spent most of the fight on his bicycle, and despite his corner's attempts to kind of like motivate him to just sort of go out there and start blasting everything, kind of letting it all out there. But that's, I think Cory made the right decision to get on his bicycle and kind of evade for the rest of the round, because trying to go all out would have, I think it would have got Cory finished, really. At the rate the beatdown was going, I think Cory was liable to get hurt if he followed that advice. And anyway, Cory's on his bicycle, kind of evading. Yan finds the spot, throws a throwaway 1-2. Cory kind of half-assedly, he's already faded, kind of like barely manages to cover up with one hand. And then Yan immediately, with no delay, spins and hooks his heel around Cory's guard and for a clean connection. Just decks Cory on the point of the chin. And that's where, well, not on the point of the chin, on the jaw. And that's one which is kind of, it's one of the instances where, well, yes, Cory's chin is insane, but also like the mechanics, the technique, just off the charts. It's a movie combination. Max Holloway actually does something similar, where he would throw a 1-2 or a 1-1-2 and then immediately spin around for a connection to the body. And it's also a combination that Yan used. I think it was in the second round, where he also threw a 1-2 and then kicked Cory in the gut. Oh, and he also connected with a very clean head kick in the fifth. He kind of used the double attack once again, kind of showed that he's going to throw the left hand, and then threw that massive, extremely clean high kick that connected clean on the jaw, and Cory once again didn't go out. But I mean, make no mistake, that kick would have taken out 99% of the division. Cory's chin is crazy, but still not crazy enough where I would feel comfortable advising him to kind of try and go out in his shield in the fifth. Ryan actually told me that another cool setup for the spin kick that he likes was to throw a shifting rear hook, and then from there you can spin through and connect with the spinning kick. It sounds like a very dynamic and cool setup. I want to try it out. But anyway, that's my recap of the fight. And I guess what needs to be done here, what needs to be done right now, is kind of like explain why the fight happened the way it happened. Multiple people have already written their analysis on the fight. I'm just going to quote Danny Martin for this one. So, combines like if you take Yan's ability to pivot and create angles, he's the kind of fighter. I'm quoting right now, quoting Danny Martin's thread here. He's the kind of fighter who will be in range for someone like Cory, but won't be easy to hit without return fire very often. And this is something that Ryan talks about when it comes to Muay Thai, where people kind of combine, people kind of flow through these offensive defensive phases. It's they're combining offense with their defense. It's not just all defense or all offense. And in MMA, Yan, I think, is the best at doing that. He understands. This is Danny speaking right now. He understands the meta. He understands the meta of the sport being about volume, but he configured the game to counter the output that defines fighters like Cory or Aljamain Sterling. They're used to overwhelming their opponents with volume, and I've talked about this in the beginning, Yan has learned to punish that type of process. So Cory would jab, Yan would immediately dip under and counter jab, or maybe like duck under the jab and then throw an uppercut, roll and then roll into a low kick and all that kind of stuff. He was like doing like half a dozen things, half a dozen other things from moment to moment. And this is what is just plain has more depth. Cory looks to extend exchanges, and this is very dangerous to do against Yan, because if you go back and watch his fight against Jose Aldo, where Jose Aldo got hurt, usually at the end of combinations, that's kind of Yan kept turning the exchanges deeper and deeper, going way past first layer exchange and second layer exchange. What do I mean by first layer exchange? First layer exchange is where you the opponent throws a jab, you dip under the jab and throw the right hand. That's a first layer exchange. It's easy to do these things on a hair trigger. And especially against guys who throw so much volume. We've talked about this. Ryan talked about this on his Twitter page. This this piece of shit should already write an article about something, you know. But I guess since he's written so much, I guess the fire just isn't there. Either way, with guys who throw so much volume and so much feint, they're hard to counter, because if you try to counter on a hair trigger, it's difficult to distinguish the real openings from just the general static, you know. If you try to throw, like, let's say, the way like Iggy does. Iggy is actually one of the better guys when it comes to throwing, in the middle of his opponent's combination. But when a lesser fighter tries to do that and throw counter strikes on the hair trigger, using like distance as a hair trigger, using certain punches as a hair trigger, the aforementioned duck under the jab followed with the right hand. If you mistake the feint or the non-committal strike for a genuine opportunity, you're liable to miss more often than you land. This has the knock-on effects of exhausting you and opening you up for a counter to your own counter. And this is what I say, what I mean when I talk about layers of... this is what analysts in general talk about when they speak about layers of exchanges, layered exchanges. This is a fighter start countering each other's counters, trying to draw out a certain counter to counter that counter, and while if the opponent is good, he anticipates the counter to his counter coming, and he counters that counter, you know? It's kind of like, it goes like a... You can continue this ad nauseum, depending on the fighter's level. And so Yan would counter the punches with longer strikes. He would counter the punches with kicks. He would counter in combination while retreating or advancing. He would shift and counter. He would use the counters to steal the initiative and put Cory in the back foot. He would That's what I'm talking about, punishing Cory's offense. He forced Cory back by constantly by distinguishing the static, the real opportunities from the static. Cory would try to land a double jab into an uppercut. Yan would defend the jabs, kind of like pull back from the uppercut, and then advance with a shifting combination and force Cory backwards. That's what we were talking about. Or Cory would try to pepper Yan with straight punches. Yan would either take them on the guards and kind of like slip some of them, and then immediately blast the kick. And so Yan kept stripping Cory of his tools, chipping away at him, taking the tools away from him, punishing Cory for trying to implement new tools. Everything Cory had in his arsenal, Yan had an answer to that tool. And it wasn't something rote. He didn't answer with these predetermined set combinations. He constantly varied the timing of his punches, constantly varied the type of strike that he's going to use. He would constantly adjust the angle on which he was striking. He connected with many rear left straights. And I've talked about this before, but a straight punch doesn't mean the arm itself has to be ramrod straight. A punch is straight because it travels along a straight line. And so the way Yan punches, it's kind of like it's textbook Soviet-style punching. He would kind of turn his shoulder over so that it protects his chin and kind of allows him to vary the distance upon which he connects, and it allows him to vary the angle upon which he throws the strike. And also one thing that has to be pointed out about the way Yan strikes, it's mechanics more than anything, it's technique. He constantly punches like he wants to punch through his opponent. He doesn't seek to club him. Doesn't seek to kind of just... it's not connections for connection's sake. He tries to really, really hurt his opponent. It's very evident by the way he punches to the body, for example. Cory would kind of like throw a bunch of jabs and connect with several body shots, and those body shots are kind of like slappy hooks, kind of shoe shining a little. And against most opponents it's fine, but not against opponents who are as conditioned as Yan. And when Yan punched Cory to the body, the contrast is just so evident. It looks like Cory was doubling over after each body punch that Yan's connected with. And it wasn't Cory, I guess, it didn't look like Cory was reacting in pain, but it was a result of the way Yan was punching. He would connect, he would continue, like kind of, he wasn't pushing the strikes. It was a very sharp connection, but it kind of looked like the connection continued through Cory's body. It's very hard to explain. I guess it has to be done by feel. Don't quite know how to put that in words that would be easy to kind of like break down the way it feels to kind of throw a punch like that. But I guess it can just go back and watch the fight and kind of look for that specifically. And the way Yan was pressuring, man, the way he was pressuring, he was able to push Cory backwards using only his feet. That's what real pressure fighting looks like. And the corner kept saying to him, eat away at him, eat away at him. Keep eating away at the distance. And that's what essentially, that's the best way to describe what Yan was doing with his foot positioning. His foot was constantly positioned towards Cory's center line, and so he was constantly angled to attack. And whenever Cory adjusted his position, Yan would adjust his position accordingly so that his foot was kept in such a position, in such a way that it keeps pointing at the center line. He keeps staying in the position to attack. The reason why Cory was constantly retreating was because Yan was in range to throw and hurt Cory. It wasn't Cory just conceding space for no reason. Cory was actually using good footwork to kind of try and evade Yan, and the way he was kind of like bicycling away from Yan in the fifth round was still composed. It wasn't just him kind of like sprinting across the cage like someone like, for example, like I guess Overeem or Gustafsson. Like when you contrast Cory's movement and Yan's movement, Cory's steps are way bigger than Yan's. like if you haven't trained to fight, it would seem like it would be more efficient to take a big step. In fighting, no, that's not the case. Because in fighting, when you make big steps, it's actually easier to cut you off. It's easier to read your movement. It's easier to understand where you're going to go. Cory mixed in some smaller steps. It was still way better than the average type of footwork that you see in MMA. But if you look at the way Yan moves, he would take 10 steps to move like a foot. And by foot, I mean, the style of measurement, not his feet, not his actual feet. Basically, like, make 10 steps to move half a meter, I guess, or maybe less. And what this lets him to do is to constantly stay in position to fire back with offense or to intercept his opponent. And it's also way harder to read, because it's kind of like just, you don't exactly pay attention to it. And if you look at the way Yan's head moves whenever he moves around the octagon, if you look at the way Cory moves, his head and upper body are constantly bobbing up and down and bobbing and weaving. I guess it can be incorporated into defensive movements, and in fact, it's what I would advise most people to do. But if your style of defense is to kind of like use your upper body movement a lot, but one problem with that is that even if you miss the movement of the feet, you can still guess the direction in which the opponent is going to move if his head is bobbing up and down, or like from side to side. If you look at the way Yan moves, his head barely moves. The level of his head stays, level. It's kind of like, I guess, like a gyroscope, almost. The head stays in the same head slot, in the same triangle, What do I mean by that? Well, a head slot is the position of the head into which, you slot your head. It's kind of like there's different head slots, and depending on the head slot, you can throw a different strike from there, and you can counter that head slot with a different strike, and you can use the head slot as a feint. You put your head, kind of dip your head to the side a little bit, and then you show your opponent. You kind of program your opponent to think that he's gonna be able to get you there. And the triangle is just, it's kind of like, it's the 3 points that are formed by the head and by the shoulders. And there's also other type of triangles on your body. And fighters are generally taught to throw, Soviet boxers are generally taught to throw into a specific triangle. It just makes commands easier, kind of allows for easier explanation of certain concepts when you're giving instructions to fighters. It's like a very long documented type of terminology. Anyway, Yan is amazing. One of the best displays of striking in MMA in a long, long while. I would say it's the best striking performance I've seen in MMA in general. People have called this the greatest title fight in recent memory, and I do not agree with that. It wasn't much of a fight, it was more of a performance. Cory is obviously dog tough, just incredibly skillful, and what made this fight especially interesting for me is the way Yan navigated the margins presented to him by Cory. But I wouldn't call it much of a fight, It was more of a showcase performance. I mean, I've had this discussion with Kyle McLachlan and Conor Rebush the other day where, Conor Rebush was having a discussion with Kyle McLachlan, and I just decided to chime in, and then we proceeded to talk with Kyle about this. But it may be a result of my youth and the fact that I haven't been watching this the whole thing for as long as Kyle was. But I don't have like strict criteria where I can split performances from kind of fights and that kind of stuff. Trying to split a performance like that at this level from a good fight at this level and define them on such strict criteria, it's kind of like splitting hairs. That's just how I personally feel about what I'm seeing. It's just all subjective regardless. What I'm trying to say is that even if there were no notable momentum shifts in the Yan-Sandy fight, the way Yan was able to navigate the margins presented to him by Sandy was so interesting that I don't even care if the fight was back and forth or not in the end. To go one step further, I'd like to compare this fight to something like Fury versus Wilder 3. It wasn't really much of a fight, really, by that metric, you know? Because aside from getting bombed a couple times by Wilder, the rest was pretty much one-way traffic by Fury. And if you zoom out and give a dumbed-down, simplified account of both fights, then sure, Fury getting dropped by the biggest puncher in the division is extremely dramatic. However, Wilder was also thoroughly outclassed to the point of receiving career-threatening damage. Meanwhile, while there is no doubt that Sandy got completely broken down by the end, what pulls this fight ahead for me is that Yan took all of Sandy's best tools away from him through counters, adjustments, and positional superiority. You could argue that the same thing happened in Fury vs. Wilder 3. However, I must point out that there was no real area of the fight where Yan outclassed Sandy so thoroughly as Fury outclassed Wilder in the clinch. What made this performance special was that Yan combined all his skills together, and his mastery of transitional attacks and command over the margins and ability to leverage his intangibles. That's what broke Sandy, not one singular thing. And this is what made me enjoy this fight much more than the ones like people frequently mention as being great fights. And that's just me, not telling everyone how they should enjoy this sport. Anyway, Yan's mastery of mixed martial arts, it kind of swept me off my feet, really. I think the man is a generational talent. Yeah, not much of a fight, really, but still an incredible performance and an incredible example of problem solving at a truly elite level. That's how I would describe this fight. Certainly a very dogged, certainly a very, I would say that even in the loss, it was still a very intelligent performance from Cory. It's just that Yan was simply so much better in every area. Not in like a singular area, because with certain intangibles coming into play, I guess Cory could have won some of those exchanges, but it was, as I've said, the combination of all factors that made Yan's performance so special, and that's why he was able to dominate so thoroughly. Yeah. I could talk about this performance for much longer than I have already did. I suppose I genuinely could make a watch along episode where I break down the exchanges, individual exchanges, like sequence by sequence, because there's just so much to admire. And we saw performances like Cory's. We saw the process, Cory's process, break other fighters so easily. The volume, the feints. It's so hard to look defensively competent against that. It's so hard to defend against that sort of output. It's so hard to defend against such a variety, such a varied output, such a variety of tools that Cory used. But and Yan navigated that with ease. It's I think Hacks put it best. Petr Yan is the type of fighter against whom you may have the performance of your lifetime, but it's not going to matter in the end. Now that's something special. Anyway, I guess this is the point where I should sign off. As I've said in the beginning, I'm going to cover the rest of the card on part 2 of this podcast. Certainly an excellent card all around, with some hiccups here and there. I think you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about those hiccups, especially a single particular hiccup. on the UFC's and I guess the Athletic Commission's part at length. No worries, I'm going to discuss it at length. And yeah, stay tuned. Stay tuned for part 2 of this recap of UFC 267. This has been TENGRIDOME episode 27, the breakdown and recap of Sandhagen versus Yan. This was with you, as always, was your host Iggy, and see you soon. If you've got any questions, if you wish for me, if you'd like to hear me elaborate on some of the things that I've said in this breakdown, because I was kind of doing this off the cuff. I wanted to prepare a script, but just kind of like, after a certain point, I realized that it would be more efficient to actually write a whole article, and I think the article part is going to be covered by other staff members of the fight site. Particularly, I think Dan Albert is going to write something about Yan. And yeah, if you've got any questions, then you can join our Discord for as little as $5 per month, and it allows you, gives you access to all of the stuff that we've released, particularly the alternate commentary for last weekend's event. Sriram and Fenyo covered I think the top 3 fights at least, or maybe more. And, I haven't talked about this, but man, DC's commentary, Jesus Christ. I think everyone who was live tweeting during that event kind of noticed that DC was essentially podcasting in there, not actually talking about what was happening. And he genuinely, Jan's pressure proved to be too much for DC's brain to handle. That's what it was. Like, Cory would backpedal like 10 steps, and then like DC would be like, oh, look at that footwork, Cory's gone, and then Cory gets decked with the left straight, backing off, and like, oh yeah, Cory Sandhagen, his movement is so good, he's making Petr Yan miss a lot, and then Petr Yan connects with 6 punches in a row. Meanwhile, Felder was by contrast, Felder was very, very good during that card. He has his moments where he kind of like makes mistakes, but I think he's improved. He's much improved these days. He's improving. He cares about becoming a better commentator. Meanwhile, DC is more preoccupied with shilling for his teammates on commentary in the booth. Just atrocious. So I highly recommend you check out the alternate commentary, and also join our Discord so we can gush about good performances and good fighters some more with like-minded fans. There's also been a lot of cool grappling sequences on this card, which I'm going to talk about in part 2. And on to kind of like sort of tie these things together, we've released a BJJ instructional on the gooseneck guillotine. Like, we all saw sequences where a fighter would grab a hold of a guillotine from top mount and wouldn't be able to finish it. Well, that instructional explains precisely the steps you need to take to finish the guillotine from that position. So it's very helpful for both beginners and advanced students of jiu-jitsu as well. Highly recommend you check it out. You can purchase it for $60, make a one-off purchase, or you may join our Discord at the $50 tier, and also gain a ton of access. To gain access to all the stuff that we've released. So I would say it's a bargain. Naturally, the Discord benefit also comes with that, and yeah, you can always just drop your pledge down to something more manageable if you don't feel like supporting us at that higher tier. Anyway, now that I've plugged everything, I think that's everything. Anyway, yeah, as I've said, see you soon. Stay tuned for part 2 of this recap. And yeah, see you later. Bye.